Hi, everyone. This is Rob Doggett here on behalf of the International Yeats Society and coming to you from the State University at New York as part of our ongoing series of Yeats Conversations. I'm here today with Adam Hanna. How you doing, Adam? Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for asking me to do this.
It's a pleasure, and you and I know each other from years ago at the Yeats International Summer School. You were actually in one of my seminars of I think it was like 20 years ago, maybe. Um,
About your take.
yeah, and it was such a treat to see you this past summer, and you gave a fantastic lecture at the summer school. So it was a real pleasure catching up. You're at your lecture at University College Cork, and the author of two monographs. One I know that's fantastic: Northern Irish Poetry and Domestic Space. They came out with Palgrave in 2015, and I haven't looked at the newer one, Poetry, Politics, and the Law in Modern Ireland. That came out with Syracuse pretty recently, 2022. So I'm looking forward to reading that as well. So what are you working on right now in your research?
Well, now I'm catching up on all the things that I ignored for years while I was doing the book. So I guess I've been working on Heaney and art, which I'd promised someone. I'm working on another chapter on being an Irish poet, which I promised someone else. This summer, I got to go back to Yeats and work on the domestic space actually I was invited to do. So it was a pleasure to go back through those notes and look through things again. And I'm putting something together actually for the centenary of Yeats's Nobel Prize. I've been asked to give a talk about that. So that is coming up in November. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's the mix.
And the International Yates Society is doing. We're doing our conference in for the centenary in Stockholm. So that's going to be. I'm looking forward to getting over there and catch up with lots of folks as well. So it'll be a busy year in Yates studies. Um, we're going to talk about Coole Park 1929, and we were talking at the summer school, and I'd heard your lecture, and so I sort of normally I give people a choice overall, but I sort of slanted it a little bit in this direction. But you really kindly said, "Oh, I'd love to talk about that poem." So what's interesting to you about this poem, or why did you want to talk about it?
Sure. Okay, well, I guess it goes as far back as my own studies in Yeats do. I was writing my doctorate many years ago, shortly after we met, actually, and it was about domestic spaces in Irish poetry. That ended up being what my first book was about. In the end, that first book was about domestic spaces and travels poetry, but I really wanted to get some Yeats in there. I realized that Yeats was a kind of unwieldy annex to the wider project, and I just couldn't publish it in the book. So I was really glad to like have the chance to go to Sligo and dig out that work again. Um, why this poem though? It's this magnificent kind of crepuscular
Mhm.
blink and you'll miss it. Here is your last chance to kind of see all these things which are vanishing. There's Yeats standing in the last minutes of sunset, possibly a sunset in 1929, possibly a sunset at some undetermined point in the future. So
Mhm.
it's got it's one of these poems, one of his prospective looks at retrospect. He's trying to guide us as we look back at something, projecting himself out of the tyranny of time. And so I really I enjoy just those prospective elegies that he does so many of in his late years. There are these grand architectural forms he chooses, these great ottava rima
Yeah.
stanzas, these sort of permanent monuments almost. But to discuss things where he wants to show time is racing away with this thing, it's actually really evanescent. It's on the cusp of disappearance. I love that tension, I guess, between monumentality and permanence, and blinking and you'll miss it. It's about to go.
That's exactly what I was thinking about this morning as I was. Boy, trucks are driving outside my house right now. I hope they're not. The sound's not coming in. I was walking to the woods this morning and I called up the poem on my phone and I was reading again. And that was the thing that struck me was the way time works in the poem. It's really interesting, actually, like what the way time sort of moves and what time are we in during the sort of present of the poem. It's kind of projecting in different ways, and sometimes it's uncertain, as you pointed out with the sunset. I was also thinking too about the occasion of it, as intended, a poem that was intended at first to be the intro to Lady Gregory's last major work, Coole. So as a kind of introduction to that, so as a kind of monument and that idea of permanence, a monument, poem about monuments, a poem serving as a kind of monument, and then serving in Augusta Gregory's book, and then that idea of impermanence and instability in time and change. So I think we're, the things that you brought up are the things that interest me too. So that's great. But I'm going to shut up. How about you share your screen and you read the poem, and we'll work our way through it.
Hey, be a pleasure. All right, here goes. Coole Park, 1929. I meditate upon a swallow's flight, upon an aged woman and her house, a sycamore and lime tree lost in night, although that western cloud is luminous. Great works constructed there in nature's spite, for scholars and for poets after us. Thoughts long knitted into a single thought, a dance-like glory that those walls begot. There Hyde, before he had beaten into prose that noble blade the muses buckled on. There one that ruffled in a manly pose for all his timid heart. There that slow man, that meditative man, John Synge. And those impetuous men, Shaw Taylor and Hugh Lane, found pride established in humility, a scene well set, and excellent company. They came like swallows, and like swallows went. And yet character could keep a swallow to its first intent, and half a dozen in formation there that seemed to whirl upon a compass point, found certainty upon the dreaming air, the intellectual sweetness of those lines that cut through time or cross it withershins. Here, traveler, scholar, poet, take your stand, when all those rooms and passages are gone, when nettles wave upon a shapeless mound and saplings root among the broken stone, and dedicate, eyes bent upon the ground, back turned upon the brightness of the sun and all the sensuality of the shade, a moment's memory to that laureled head.
That's lovely, Adam. Thanks. What a nice poem. It's one that I often have not taught because I'm usually pressed for time when I get to the Winding Stair, trying to get through a bunch of those. There's so many monumental poems in that collection or in that volume, and I usually end up doing Coole and Ballylee instead, the poem right after it, and I sort of have missed this one, but I taught it this summer at the Yeats Summer School, and after listening to your lecture and really have found that it resonates with students, and it's one of those poems in Yeats that I'm sort of realizing, wow, I think it's it's fantastic, and I need to focus on it. Um, so I'm wondering, the first stanza, if you want to start maybe by talking about the time of the poem, like when are we? When is this night? And that curious, although that western cloud is luminous. So what is the moment here of the poem?
I mean, on the one hand, it seems very specific. He's given us a year at the beginning,
Right.
19, given us a western cloud, well, the sun setting in the west, I guess, and the sun going down behind that cloud. But on the other hand, and I'm going to just throw in a bit of kind of academic jargon, but Yeats has these deictic words that point in all kinds of directions, the deictic being that, this,
Hmm.
here, things that point you places. He gets really into that, especially after the tower, as if he's pointing to solid, tangible things on the landscape that you can get to grips with. And people talk about that, the increased specificity of his work. But I guess the flip side of all these kind of certain deictic words is that this and that and those can kind of mean anything and anywhere. They always point towards more than one thing, and I find that as I go through this poem. I'll give you an example from this stanza. There's the dance like glory that those walls begot. Now he
Hmm.
hasn't actually shown us a this. It's like it's what Stephanie Burt called the establishing shot, but it
Hmm.
doesn't really have an image of the house in it. So there's this central uncertainty about the walls. Are these the estate walls of Coole? Are these the walls of the house? Are these indeed, so are those walls? I sometimes wonder if he's talking about the ottava rima form itself, that strong arched form, as Seamus Heaney called it, which holds the dance-like glory of the poem within it. So,
Hmm.
as I say, we're kind of, in a way, he's kind of pointing us towards being in a certain time in a certain place, and yet as the poem goes on, strange things happen to time, so that by the time we're in the final stanza, back turned upon the brightness of the sun, in a way, is this the setting sun that we saw in the first stanza, or are we at some unknowable future point? I think that his deictic words, they point us in all kinds of directions, and the more I read them, the more directions they point in.
I think that's fascinating, and that's I think what strikes me about time in the poem, that there's a notion of specificity and linearity, and then this antithetical absence of specificity and multiple possibilities of existing in time, and somehow different from the tyranny of linear time. I think that Withershins uh, reference later sort of gets at that. I think the walls, that what you're saying about the walls is fascinating too. I think of walls of the home, but also so many ruins, so many big houses had been in ruins by this point, and all that remained were some walls. So in some ways, it fits this idea of a future time when perhaps the most of the house is gone, and all that's left are some boundary walls. As a possibility there as well, and also the Ottava Rima, which when Yeats is being when Yates uses a tabarima, he's like, I'm being serious. Like this is a serious poem here. I'm going to use my grand form here. And so I like the idea of way pointing to the poem itself as well.
Yeah, that's right. And going back to that idea of the ruined walls of the Anglo-Irish, I do think this seems to me a very Anglo-Irish poem in a way that it, with an intensity that a lot of his kind of late roll calling elegiac poems weren't. Say if you go to something like Municipal Gallery Revisited, there is space in that ottava rima for for Arthur Griffith and for Kevin
Mhm.
O'Higgins. There is space in other like in All Souls Night for this whole rackety crew of decadents and magicians who he knew in his youth in London. But look at the roll call here. There's Lady Gregory, obviously, as the sponsoring presence, Douglas Hyde of French Park, John Synge of Glanmore, Shaw Taylor of Castle Taylor, Hugh Lane, part of that extended Anglo-Irish clan, the Gregorys, and who later actually became associated with perhaps the grandest of all these houses, because of course Charlemont House in Dublin became the home of the Hugh Lane Gallery.
Mm,
So
mm,
this is this more than his other late roll calls seems specifically a sort of summoning of the energies of the Anglo-Irishry. Um,
mhm.
those who dwelled behind the domain walls, so many of them, as you say, tumbled or soon to tumble, as in the case of Coole Park.
Hmm. I thought James Pethica has a really nice article in the recent issue of International Yeats Studies talks a bit about the drafts of these poems, but he mentioned some of the references in Yeats's autobiographies to the different kinds of characters, and he talks about these different qualities of the Anglo-Irish. One, a sort of dynamism and outward sort of worldview, more cosmopolitan, this kind of energy, and then another one that was more inward looking and a kind of stabilizing, but also a more violent and more sort of dominant. And so these different characters of these different aspects of the Anglo-Irish, that kind of energy and dynamism versus inwardness and stability, combining in the two. And I like what you said about dance like glory, but that's fascinating, right? Like the idea of walls suggesting to me a structure and stability, but dance as motion in the midst of it too.
Yeah, that's right. That's like how those walls forgot. That's right. Yeah, how the form, I guess, can generate energy within it. And so many of these Ottava Rima poems meditate on that about, I mean, take the first stanza of Sailing to Byzantium.
Yeah.
He begins that he's no country for old men. So you have these old men, and then the final line of that stanza is caught in that sensual music, all neglect monuments of unaging intellect. And so
Hmm.
you have this reference to, old men, monumentality, and then in the middle, this incredible swirl of macro fall, was it salmon falls and macro crowded sea
Right.
birds. So I think he was captivated by the way that the form could, I guess, summon and contain the energies within it. And so when he ends this stanza, of course, translating into the Italian for room, when he finishes it with a reference to the walls, I do think that he's showing how it can contain things that flow and change and things that disappear. Because the thing about this stanza is it's all about things that disappear. That's what he hoped for from his poetry. These things that would disappear could be given a life to live on in. I mean, if we look at the things he's showing us, what do we know but that they go, that swallows appear for a season and vanish off thousands of miles away? The aged woman is obviously, in her waning days. Trees, clouds at nightfall in particular. He's really
Mhm.
laying it on thick. These things are evanescent, blink and you'll miss them.
I thought the syntax is interesting too. As sycamore and lime tree lost in night, although that western cloud is luminous, and gives us that sense of just about. The second we're thinking, oh, these have been lost, but then there's darkness, but then there's a reminder of luminosity and being in that like moment of what will be passing, or what is about to pass, what is about to be in darkness. I think captures that perfectly. What So in the second stanza, you mentioned some of the people here. Just for some people who are maybe a little bit more new to Yeats, who's the one that ruffled in manly pose for all his timid heart? Who's this joker in the midst of all these? The only person that's not named here in
Right.
this
And
group of.
yet, it would, well, I mean, okay, if we just take the poem on its own terms, this is one of these great sort of Yeats deictic words. I am pointing to a thing, there one, there they are.
Right.
And yet, who is this mysterious slouching character? I mean, just look at the grammar of it. There
Right.
one, it could be an intensifier of the description of John Synge. Because, okay, so first of all, there's Hyde, who did this. There, one that ruffled in a manly pose for all his timid heart. And then, comma, are we still talking about the same man? There, that slow man, that meditative man, John Synge. It sounds like a big, big build-up to telling us John Synge.
Right.
So, I mean, the poem kind of points us in that direction. And yet, Yeats actually points us in another direction. If we look at this poem in comparison to that grand corpus, those millions of words that Yeats have left us, he actually, there in the thicket of autobiographical prose, leaves us another clue, because he wrote an essay where he talked about some of the characters in this, and he actually tells us he meant himself, the one who ruffled in a manly pose for all his timid heart. that was me, he said. That's what I meant. I have to say, this is where we come across that eternal question: how far do we trust or believe the poet when they try to provide us with critical exegesis?
Hmm.
He's
Hmm.
If we read the paratextual materials and we take them on trust, then I guess, through modesty perhaps, or through the timidity, his timid heart does not name himself. Um, but the grammar of the poem maybe doesn't include Yeats himself. As I say, it wouldn't be beyond him to give. I mean, Sing, I think I'm right in saying he gets a lot of I think he's the last man named in the Municipal Gallery
Hmm.
revisited.
Hmm.
Oh, what is it now? Forgetting Human Words and so on.
Right, right.
He did sort of lay on thick the encomiums for John Sing. And yet, as I say, he points us in another direction as well. But it's an example of where he writes there, as if he's pointing his finger. But actually, who is he pointing his finger at? It's this magnificent combination of certainty, the walls and frames and structures of certainty, and yet some very cloudy material when you think twice about them.
It is so interesting what you're saying here, because when I've read it, I've sometimes imagined that those lines as modifying Sing. And in fact, I think when I was first reading it, that's how I thought of it. But then I read some of the autobiographical, the paratextual elements you're talking about, and I was like, oh, that
Yeah.
makes a kind of sense too. But in the experience of reading the poem, there's the tension, and the dyadic there activates that tension, because, as you're saying, we feel as if, okay, we've got clarity here, who's being named, and then this instability. And even with Hyde, it's a little bit strange, because it's like there's Hyde, but it's Hyde before Hyde became something else. I guess before he beaten into prose that noble blade. I guess the muses buckled on, which I guess is poetry. Hyde as poet before he became more of a prose. I guess that's the idea, more of a prose writer.
Also, there's another idea lurking in those lines, which is beating a sword into a plowshare. So we know
Ah,
that
ah,
uh, Hyde is beating a blade here. But of course, the idea is that, you take the weapons of war and you turn them into peaceable things for prosperity and increase rather than things to destroy your enemies with. So on the one hand, he's talking about Hyde's progress as a writer. But on the other hand, he's, I think, introducing us to this idea of magnanimity,
uh,
open-heartedness,
uh.
open-handedness, these qualities which he wants to pass on to the new free state. Um, I think
That's
that
great. I had not thought about that, but that makes a lot of sense to think about the trajectory of Hyde, and using Hyde in that way makes a lot of sense to me.
no, that's right. I do think that that's. I mean, this is the message that these Ottava Rima poems seem to have for us is to do with pride, like that of the morn when the headlong light is loose. That he wanted to bequeath pride to his heirs. I think in some ways this is a very free state poem, and I think we have to see it in the
Mhm.
context of Coole Park, 1929. Of course, it was in the ownership of the Irish state for 2 years. By that point, it had been sold by Margaret Gregory, who wanted the money, frankly, for her next marriage. But when I see that year, 1929, what comes to mind is the Censorship Act of 1929, that document which was to control intellectual life or attempt to control it, and which led to over 12,000 books being banned. One of the most draconian censorship regimes certainly in Western Europe, of the 20th century. So I do when I see that year 1929, it does lead my mind in thoughts of what kind of Ireland did Yeats want to see? What kind of exemplars did he want to draw its mind towards?
It's
So
fascinating to set the poem in that context, because Yeats, if looking at his Senate speeches from this period, uh, there's so much of an interest in monuments and what is being preserved and what is the meaning of what do monuments mean, and that kind of tension between preserving these monuments from the past but are of a different Ireland and imagining a different sort of Ireland of the future, and what can monuments what's the role of monuments in that that transformation. And so I never thought of the poem really in those terms as a sort of free state poem, but that totally makes sense to me. That's I think that's fantastic.
I think so, and I think that the uh he knows that this house will not be part of, that the house itself, so he has to kind of find uses and meanings for emptiness.
Right.
Lady Greg sold the house in 1927. She actually wrote about how glad she was that, what was it, the mysteries of the ever flowing lake will still be there, the woods will still be there. She had no illusions that this house would stay standing. And you can see that reflected in Yeats's poem as well, where he talks at the end, skipping ahead a bit, about the nettles waving upon the shapeless mound.
Mhm.
So what? And of course, if this is a poem, as I say, which seems to draw upon the memories of Anglo-Ireland to an unusual extent, I think, for these kind of roll call poems, you've got to remember, I mean, 40,000, but in the first years of the state, 40,000 Protestants had left. And so I think that what Yeats is doing is he's doing that Yeatsian thing, which is taking what is vanishing, declining, disappearing, and giving it a home. I mean, in his early days, these were the kind of myths and legends of the people, of the fishermen and sea pilots who talked to him
Mhm.
in Sligo.
Mhm.
Here we have the mythology and legends of the Anglo-Irish. So as I say, you have Hyde, who collected stories. You have Synge, who wrote of the Aran Islands. Shaw Taylor's a more obscure name. I don't think he's lasted in the annals that long, but he was a somebody who Yeats wrote about in his memoirs again, who was created the impetus behind a 1903 Act of Parliament that allowed Irish farmers to buy out their landlords and set themselves up as independent, as property owners, in short. And then, of course, Hugh Lane, who gave his paintings. So what we have is this idea of open-handedness and pride, Yeats says. Now, in Yeats's writings on censorship, pride and censorship are opposites of each other.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
had a wonderful speech he gave in 1926 when the crowds were rioting against O'Casey's Plough in the Stars. And one of the things he has to say about those riots is that a nation that is proud can look at itself with all its faults, can say, I did these things wrong. A nation that is vain, he sets pride against vanity, is touchy, wants other people to think well of it, and therefore wants to sort of bask in whatever little kind of rays of reflected glory that they can get from the good opinions of others. And therefore, a vain nation, he said, is inclined to censorship. It worries about what people think. So I think that this idea of pride in Coole Park 1929 is tied to his arguments about the Censorship Act of 1929.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. I wonder. So we have this kind of in the second stanza. We have this this collection of men, and we
Yes.
don't have who I think represent different sort of forms of masculinity, and the idea is sort of brought together in this combination of stability and dynamism, pride and humility, all of these opposites brought together in one somehow through what? And I think that's the interesting thing. Like, what is the element that allows this kind of this combination? And I guess the one sense is it's the house, perhaps it's the house itself, but then it seems to be more here in this third stanza a woman's powerful character. So the woman is obviously Lady Gregory, and I think it's interesting to think about the poem. Like, what is it about Lady Gregory's character that enabled this sort of bringing together? And I'm not sure the poem doesn't. I'm not sure it's clear the poem wants to give us any sort of definitive answer other than to suggest there's this somehow force of character. But I'm wondering anyway. That's a lead into the to whatever you want to say here about the third stanza.
Third stanza. No, I think that you're right, that we actually don't know. She's not named in
Right.
the. She's, yeah, what we are told is that she has this kind of magnetic ability to shape and guide the courses of others. In a way, and maybe I'm imagining this, she keeps half a dozen in formation there, these flying animals. She seems like a squadron leader. I don't
Right.
think because, yeah, like there are these flying birds and she keeps them in formation. Oddly, just before he died, her son Robert Gregory was made a squadron leader as well. I do sometimes wonder about the invisible presence of Robert Gregory in these poems. You read a poem like Wild Swans at Coole from 1919, these swans rising on clamorous wings.
Mm.
I Images of kind of the aerial and the airborne kind of cluster in these poems, and I do wonder how much the shade of Robert Gregory is behind them. But yeah, exactly, that she had this power to keep her squadron in formation. It's a poem all about direction and orientation. There's the compass point, there's withershins, there's your back turned upon the brightness of the sun, but the western cloud is luminous. As
Hmm.
I say, poems become very kind of, how do I put it? They are very grounded in a place and in a moment, even if the more you think about this place and moment, the more uncertain the specifics become. Um, yeah, the intellectual sweetness of those lines. This line kind of calls me up short because immediately, of course, your first line are thought of lines of poetry. I mean, where do you go with that? The sweetness of those lines.
I mean, the lines, I mean, one way to think about it, of course, you're saying is the poem, then the lines of the movement of the swallows, and then referring back to the sort of movement of these men through time, and sort of this orientation of all these sort of living things moving through time, and then this kind of orientation, the way that this force of character somehow directs them. Um, and the question for me is always, how does that direction work? I mean, the reference back to the dancing, I sort of think about a whole tradition of big house culture and hostesses and organized dancing in drawing rooms. I think about the history of Yeats's drama, where some of the dancing plays were performed in drawing houses. So there's a kind of these lines of movement, of direction, of development, to metaphorically of development, all being sort of oriented and shaped by this powerful sort of character coming into one in a moment.
And she can
Go ahead.
perform, or yeah, just very quickly, that she can perform the most powerful magic that Yeats aimed towards, which is the reversal of the waste and loss and devastations of time. I mean, you
Yeah,
go way back.
yeah,
Ushin, what does Ushin want? He wants to avoid like falling into decay and death like St. Patrick. What do they want in this? What does the stolen child give us? This idea of escape into this eternal world, away from a world more full of weeping than you can understand. And so I think that that's what's this is the tribute that he gives to Lady Gregory, that those lines, whether it's lines of poetry or perhaps the lines, as you say, if you follow this half dozen on a map, cut through time or cross it with her shins. I mean, if you go back to like earlier Big House poems he wrote, like The New Faces, he
hmm
talks how he and Lady Gregory worked there. We who wrought that shall break the teeth of time.
Mhm.
So on one hand, that's kind of, I guess, breaking the teeth of the wheel in a clock. It's also a really violent image, breaking anything. So like he wanted to smash time to the ground. We who wrote the show was it, I spit into the face of time that has transfigured me. He changed one of his poems to in his waning days. There's other big house poems. I
Well, you
took
think
up a
of
few.
the opening poem in this volume in
Yeah,
memory of Eva Booth Con Markovitz, bid me strike the match and blow, the burning down of time there
exactly.
as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, exactly. Strike a match and strike another until time catch. So we have burning time, cutting through time here, breaking the teeth of time. And if you look at the way the tower is structured, for example, it begins, the tower, the date would have been in the frontispiece, 1928, then Sailing to Byzantium, 1926, Meditations in Time of Civil War, 1923. So we're actually, the collection itself, it goes back and back and back through 1921, back to 1919. Eventually, it lands us on its earliest date, The New Faces,
Mm,
1912.
mhm.
He has broken the teeth of time. We're not submitting to following time chronologically. We're actually doing the opposite. So poetry could do that. It could break the teeth of time. And as I say, I find it so hard to extricate his idea of poetry from his idea of Coole Park, from his idea of the grand structure. The house itself could cut through time, could cross it with Withershins, and that weird kind of archaism.
I wanted to ask you about that term "wither shins." I had to look it up when I taught it, from one of the earliest times I taught it, and, I think literally it means counterclockwise, but it also it has other associations in Celtic literature, I think, including with magic and witchcraft, and is
It's
that
like
right?
you absolutely, you wouldn't do a turris, a kind of turn around a holy well. You would never do that anti-clockwise. It would
Oh,
bring it would of a curse. So yeah, there is a so absolutely there it's important to kind of go around a holy site clockwise. I'm trying to think
honestly, you should
of
have told me that. I don't thinking back on my visits to various sites, I'm not sure. I hope I went around clockwise.
Oh, do you know what? We actually did it. I was with some students at Coole Park last week, and we actually went in honor of this poem. We crossed it with Withershins. We actually went
All right.
around it just in anti-clockwise time back. So yeah, you can take your choice, but cut through time or cross it. So as I say, there's an idea of invoking a curse there, but I think also there's a kind of, how do I put it? A, there's the ultimate defiance, which
Yeah.
is defiance of the fear of crossing things with Withershins, but also defiance of the clock which moves in that direction. And of course, the word Withershins actually comes from following the direction of the sun, like following the course of the sun across the sky. So it goes with that sunset. We still have the sun. In a way, it reminds us of that first stanza where the sun is going down as we go down
Mm,
through the poem.
mm.
And then the more certain it seems to seem, here, traveler, scholar, poet, take your stand. As
We
I say,
suddenly get
this,
another kinetic, right? Like, we're suddenly, okay, here. And we had been there, and now we're here.
yeah, exactly, that's right. But like where, so we're here. I mean, I remember Seamus Heaney saying there's a phrase they have in Derry, which is, there you are, and where are you? And I think this is this could be the motto of this final stanza. Here, traveler, scholar, poet, take your stand. The stand within the stanza.
Mm, mm.
Who are these traveler, scholar, and poet? Are these the ghosts that he has summoned before? John Sing and who else? And Hugh Lane, or is this everybody? Is this everybody who travels there, every scholar, every poet?
Hmm.
Uh, Again, we're in a world which, as I say, invites us to very narrow readings, and they're opposite. Take your stand, and all of a sudden, we are in this future world outside of time. This is how he ends the Municipal Gallery Revisited it as well. He tells some future visitor, say, my glory was I had such friends. He's looking, he projects himself in the final stanza out of time, imagining somebody in the future and addressing them, and therefore cutting through time himself when all the passages are gone. So imagining the house disappeared, as indeed, I mean, it fell into ruin after Lady Gregory's death in 32. It was demolished entirely by 1941. When nettles wave upon a shapeless mound, what he didn't imagine is what good care the Irish state would take of it. I mean, it's beautifully
Hmm.
kept. I don't know there lately, Rob.
I've been
Uh,
there. I haven't been there in a couple of years, but they've done it a lot over the years. I've gone a couple of times, and they have done a lot of great work there, including with that visitor center, and it's
no,
really
that's right.
lovely.
Oh, very neatly done. So there's no nettles. It's actually quite a well-kept lawn on top of the foundations, and saplings root among the broken stone. I find it interesting that when he imagines decay and destruction and the loss of all things that he loves, what is it? All that caused a catch in the breath,
Yeah.
or at the end of the tower. There's always space for something new that might just begin its journey. We're on the antithetical turn of the gyre, to put it in Yeatsian terms. I mean, if you think of the devastations of the Civil War in Meditations in Time of Civil War, what he imagines are the honeybees that might come build in the empty house of the stair. Um, Saplings are rooting, a new forest is growing among the broken stone. I'd never thought about this before until I'd looked at it. But of course, what he's imagining is the seven woods taking over the house, isn't he? These are the
Mm.
saplings that would expand the seven woods. And in a way, that brings us back to his earliest poetry about this place, because he was writing about the seven woods from the moment he came. He first came to this place 1896. It took him around 15 years before he started to write of Coole Park. That's actually an observation. I think I'm quoting Daniel Albright there. I think he pointed that out. The first time we see Coole Park is when it's under threat. In a way, he only wrote about it as it was dying.
Mm.
Uh, on a house shaken by the land agitation, 1909, was the first time he wrote about it. Up until then, he could picture himself there in his poetry. He was the wandering Celt, the otherworldly bard. The seven woods were fine. It was very hard to imagine himself into this seat of Anglo-Irish dominance until it came under threat, whereupon he wrote the On a House Shaken by the Land Agitation.
Mm.
And now he wants us to dedicate, eyes bent upon the ground and back turned upon the brightness of the sun and all the sensuality of the shade. Are we in that sunset? Is the sun following its course with her shins? Sorry, diesel is the opposite of with her shins. Is the sun following its course diesel rather than with her shins down behind that luminous cloud?
Mm.
Or is this a different sun on a different day? I can't tell you. And
Yeah,
all the sensual. Oh,
well, I think that's right. I mean, that's why the poem is so effective, I think, aesthetically, because of that not to sound old-fashioned, but it is that ambiguity in this last running throughout, but in this last stanza of being here and elsewhere simultaneously and not sure and moving between the two, of course. And I love the contrast too that I think, reminds us of pride and humility, the brightness of the sun and the sensuality of the shade that gets picked up, that sort of opposition between the two,
yeah.
wedded together imaginatively in the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. Brightness of the sun, all the sensuality of the shade. Okay, so almost we're being invited to imagine ourselves outside time as well. If sun and shade are kind of functions of this turning clock of kind of cosmic clockwork, then we're being invited to step outside time ourselves and dedicate, as he says, a moment's memory to that laureled head. And so I think on the one hand, again, I just want to focus on that in the final line, because on the one hand, of course, our first thoughts go to Lady Gregory, that woman's powerful character. On the other hand, we're there at sunset. We're being invited to turn our back upon the sun. Like, what would you actually see? He's inviting us to cast our shadows. If your back is upon the sun, you're observing your own shadow. And that image of the shadow in relation to Coole Park, if we have to consider, I think, Yeats's poems as Hugh Kenner pointed out in his book, Gnomon. I love that book. It was an early work of Yeats criticism, but I think it's still worth attending to and turning back to. So Hugh Kenner pointed out to us, he said, Yeats was an architect. He wasn't a decorator. He didn't what is it now? He didn't compose poems. He wrote books. And I think even beyond that, you can actually look upon his entire corpus of work as a great poem and one that where each element informs the other elements. So when we're looking at the sensuality of the shade and the casting our shadows at Coole Park, I'd go back to the New Faces, 1912. Let the new faces play what tricks they will in the old rooms. Night cannot balance day. Our shadows roam the garden gravel still. The living they. This idea of ghostliness and shadow at Coole Park has been with him for a long, long time by the time he wrote this poem. And so, as I say, with our backs turned upon the brightness of the sun, he's inviting us to consider our own shadows. If we dedicate a moment's memory to that laureled head, is that the laureled head of Lady Gregory? Is it the laureled head of Yeats with his back turned towards the sun? Or is it the laureled head? Is it the head of the poet or the scholar or the traveler that we see there shadowed on what he imagined as the rubble of Coole Park? I think we're invited to perhaps consider our own shadows, our own legacies, what we'll leave behind by the end of this poem. So what I had started off by saying, as a dedicatory poem for a friend's book, as a meditation on the fate of Anglo-Irishry, I think becomes something much broader by the time we reach the end of that last stanza.
All of us sharing then in that. So it becomes not a monument to one person or a monument to Yeats, but this kind of sense of our own existence as having been part of something that lasts, that is not simply swept away by time.
I think that's in there. I think just to go back to that Hugh Kenner book, Gnomon, I wonder if there's there's a link between these final lines and the name of that book, because a gnomon, where Hugh Kenner got the name of his book about Yeats, was from, it's the bit of a sundial that gives its shadow. That's what the gnomon is. The name, it's Greek for one that knows, but it's also it's the thing that shows that where we are by casting a shadow. Oddly enough, and I'd love to know how much thought went into this and how much linking to Yeats' poem. If you go to Coole Park now, standing near the house, between the house or where the house stood and the autograph tree, they have they've installed a few years ago a sundial where you yourself are the gnomon. And so it gives you very direct instruction. It says, if it's this month of the year, stand here. If it's that month, stand there. So, I was there about a week ago, and so stood in the August place, which now I think of it is the ideal place to stand in the home of Augusta. And so I stood in the August place, and then where your shadow is cast, there's a clock with different numbers around, and it actually tells you pretty accurately what time of day it is, so long as you stand with your back to the sun. So they actually have given the opportunity to kind of participate in the spirit of this poem. I would love to know who was behind that and how cognizant they were of
It's
Coole Park 1929,
it's
but I think
brilliant. I
sorry.
love it too, the idea of the moment, because it captures the idea of a moment. One stands in a moment, this compressed, the almost the smallest unit of time, and then simultaneously in a poem that's about being beyond time. And sort of we're inhabiting both of those spaces as we gaze on the shadow of our own laureled heads.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. I we have the next time I go to Coole Park, I am going to stand there and I'm going to read this poem. I'm going to stand on the sundial and I'm going to gaze on my own not so my own probably bald head by that point, but not so laureled head in that moment. That's brilliant. I think that's a great way to end, Adam. Tons to think about with this poem. I had not thought of it as a free state poem at
Yeah.
all, and that's one of the things that I really love to take away from our conversation. And I think I've been spending a lot more time with my students talking about more basic. I'm not sure if it's more basic, but just different approach to poetry, and opening up more spaces for them to think about how it affects us and the aesthetic, the experience of the aesthetic. And I love the way you talk about the sense of the specific and the ambiguous in here, and the way in which we're often shuttling between these two sort of realms. And I think the poem's effectiveness is due partly or in large measure because of that that kind of tension and beautiful ambiguity in there.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's one of the kind of glories of reading Yeats, that, you know, as soon as you think you've grasped an idea, you have to go chasing off another idea. And I think that's part of the lasting power. You know, this is a poem about things coming to an end, but you know, ironically, you know, we're coming up to 100 years since its composition. There's still a lot to say about it. It still has that power to kind of to captivate.
That's why we love Yeats.
This is
What a great conversation, Adam. It's such a pleasure talking with you. I look forward to seeing you again in the not too distant future. And I'm going to go to Coole Park and I'm going to stand there on that sundial. So thanks. What a great time we had. Thanks loads. Good to see you.
and you. Bye bye.